I don't remember where they said Monroe's ancestors were from. I think it was Northeast Scotland. I can't remember exactly where it was, but he was very proud of his Scottish ancestry. Unfortunately, his house burned down in 1830, so a lot of the record, it's not there anymore, but a lot of the records and the guest house survived, and it's still there. So if you're ever visiting Monticello, it's just right down the road.
I haven't been to Monticello since, I want to say, junior high, and it's been a long time since I've been to Williamsburg. So I'm going to have to, you're reminding me I'm going to need to go. Well, Don McLeod is also quite an expert on the American Revolution era, Don, and I've learned a lot from Don. And by the way, Don, I want to congratulate you and all the North Carolinians on such a successful Black Tie Gala and weekend celebrating your St. Andrew Society of North Carolina's 50th anniversary. I was so pleased to be able to attend with you and Priscilla, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, we enjoyed having you, and enjoyed a little touring with you to Revolutionary War sites, particularly things relative to the Loyalist-Patriot conflict here during the Revolution, which was sizable and violent at times.
But was very well done. Very nice event.
Going through trying to find the first baseball game in the Isle of Man, of all places, which was actually part of Scotland for a little while in the 1300s, and found out in Chicago there was an Isle of Man, like the Scottish American Society. There was a Manxman Society that had picnics all the time, every year, just like the Scottish American Society would. And at the place in Des Plaines where they had that religious retreat grove, that they had a lot of groups had their picnics there. So it was never a Manx society as such, but it's a very interesting little tidbit of history.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Bruce. Well, I see John Armstrong. John, welcome.
Thank you very much.
John's got a very keen interest in the border country, I recall.
Yes, I certainly do.
A name like that.
Trying to live down my forebear's reputation. Johnny of Gilnockie. He was a much more interesting person than I am.
I do too, Connie. My mother's family are from the Borders area, and as kids we spent all our summers on my grandmother's farm.
Well, that's right. Well, and actually all of us have a big interest in the topic today, so we're much looking forward to hearing Cynthia. And I want to welcome everyone else. I didn't manage to call out everyone's names. Susan, we have, oh gosh, we have a lot of people joining. So I think, though, that it's 10 o'clock according to my clock. And so I'd like to, again, say hello to everyone and welcome you all, and actually wish you all a very happy New Year. I'm Connie Nestor. I chair the Scottish American History Forum. And I believe you probably all know that it is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois way back in 1845, later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. It's located in North Riverside, Illinois, and offers assisted living, shelter care, independent living, and memory care services in a lovely, homey Scottish atmosphere. So you can find out more about Caledonia by going to our website, www.chicagoscots.org. Also, I think that you're aware that Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of Caledonia. And so I hope, and I'd like to urge you all to give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care Charity. Well, now I noticed too that Gus Noble has joined us. So before we begin our presentation today, Gus, we're so pleased to have you. Gus is president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots. And Gus, we'd love you to greet everyone and bring us up to date on the latest at Caledonia, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Connie, and greetings from Caledonia Senior Living. It's a busy day here. I walked in this morning and there was some activity going on. There was a book reading going on in the front room. There was some families moving in. So it's a very kind of busy place here today. I wanted to echo Connie's best wishes for the coming year for you. Happy New Year. I hope that 2023 brings to you and your loved ones good health and every happiness, and that there are good things ahead in the new year. As we kind of approach the first month of the year with Robert Burns and his poetry in the air, we have several suppers and celebrations of Robert Burns happening in the Chicago area this month. We have one of our own, a virtual event that will be a conversation with one of the best young poets and writers in Scotland, a man named Michael Pedersen, who has written some terrific poetry. But one book he's recently published is not of poetry, it's of prose, and it's a book about friendship. He wrote it after the sad death of one of his best friends, a famous singer from the borders of Scotland, a guy called Scott Hutchison, who was in a band called Frightened Rabbit. Scott died and Michael took to his pen and started writing what he imagined would be a personal archive from which he would write some poetry about his friend. And all of a sudden, this writing wouldn't stop, and it turned into a book about friendship, about the friendships he's had that have made him who he is, that each is individual and unique. And it's really a celebration of particularly male friendship. The book is called Boyfriends. And I'm in the middle of a book club with friends reading this book, and it really has brought us back together and made us willing to share in a way that we've never done previously. So I thank Michael for that. But he's also a wonderful authority on Robert Burns and has read for the National Trust of Scotland at Burns Ellisland Farm and in the Burns Museum and Cottage. So that will be wonderful. That evening we have a celebration of Burns at Martyrs live on Chicago's North Side. That same evening, the University of Glasgow is hosting a Burns supper at the University Club here in Chicago for their alumni. We have the Nicht wi' Burns, one of the longest running in the area. And I'm sure I'm forgetting something, Jack. Correct me if I have. Of course, one that we're hosting on the north side at Lake Forest, Lake Bluff with their Historical Society at the Gorton Centre on Saturday, the 4th of February. That will feature somebody who's become a very good friend of the Chicago Scots and a personal friend of mine. Ian Houston is a writer for the Glasgow Herald. He's also a member of the board at Ellisland and runs the Scottish Business Council, a group that's really moving some commercial engagement between Scotland and the United States along very, very nicely. So Ian's a terrific authority. He'll speak about Burns through the eyes of his wife, through the eyes of Jean Armour. He's also going to look at Burns with a local interest angle, Burns and Lincoln, and he's going to look at Burns and Frederick Douglass. So a really interesting talk is promised. And as I think about an interesting talk, I think about Cynthia, and I wanted to thank you, Cynthia, for returning to us with this talk that sounds like my youth, the Anglo-Scottish Borders, Violence, Custom and Laws Broken. I grew up in Duns in the Borders, and it's a lawless country, and I spent some of my best years down there. Mum and Dad are still in Duns, and I love the area. It's where I call home. So I'll end by thanking you, Connie, for bringing us all together, for doing what you do and being who you are. We're so grateful to you. Thank you, Connie, my kinswoman of the year for 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Gus, for your leadership. And honestly, what a wonderful segue, because we want to jump right in and hear from Cynthia. I know she's going to fascinate us. I do want to remind everybody that we are going to be meeting at 10 a.m. Central Time in 2023, but the second Saturdays of the month. So don't forget that. And so I think that this is such a grand way to begin our new year. Cynthia, we're so pleased to have you. Dr. Cynthia Neville, Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and currently adjunct professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph, Canada, who is returning to us live from Ontario this morning to discuss, as Gus mentioned, Anglo-Scottish borders, violence, custom, and laws broken. So Cynthia and Jack, I'd like to turn the program over to you now, please. And everyone, please stick around. We'll have question answer at the end. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. On 30th of April, 1408, Archbishop Henry Boet of York heard the deprivation of John fire up a small and impoverished monastery of Hexham. The Archbishop condemned the fire in the strongest terms, noting that, quote, to the manifest destruction of the English realm, committed treason by receiving and cherishing the Scots and other false lieges of the king, grievous enemies of all, and notorious traitors. Helping them to invade the realm, gave no heed to the danger in which he placed himself, the free men of the realm, end quote. The Archbishop went on to state that in his mind at least, and again I quote, there is no doubt the fire perpetrated the infamous crime of lèse-majesté, that is, treason. The note to the printed edition of this record remarks, rather laconically, a startling document which shows how thoroughly disorganized was the state of society on the borders. But the grim determination to punish that's so apparent in Boet's order was entirely justifiable. For its incidents of desertion to the Scots were troublesome, none too rare among Northern land and office holders. The 18 months alone after Boet issued the order, Crown learned of another defection on the part of the formerly loyal Scottish cleric in England, as well as of the loss of one key border stronghold and the near loss of yet another, all of these the results of treasonable conspiracies. In a criminal court convened in Newcastle in 1411, when Robert Kendall was accused of having delivered the castle of Jedburgh to the Scots in the spring of 1409. Constable was later granted a pardon for his involvement in the affair, but only when he was able to show that he'd actually been in the company of the Warden of the East March at the time of the loss. The same session saw the eviction and execution of a man charged with selling the castle of Roxburgh to the king's Scottish enemies in October 1408. Here are our Scottish borders. The presence then of a national enemy hard by northern English counties of Durham, Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland.
Excuse me, Cynthia.
Yeah.
I think we may be having a little trouble hearing you. If you could pretend.
Okay,
More, thank
I'll speak up a bit, shall I?
It might help to speak
Lovely.
at the camera a little more too.
Okay, Okay.
Thank you.
The presence of a national enemy hard by the northern English counties of Durham, Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland affected a profound influence on every aspect of the region's history from 1296, when open war with Scotland erupted, till the end of the Tudor period. That influence has long been acknowledged by historians and has been reflected in a steady flow of scholarly literature, varying from discussions of the notion of Northern English history as a valid subject to examinations of border or frontier mentalities. Today, I'm going to be giving you a talk that rests on the premise that there is indeed a history of Northern England in the later medieval period, distinct from that of the rest of the kingdom and unique in its intricacies. My talk here today also rests on the assumption that much of the distinctiveness can be traced to the nearly perpetual war footing which later medieval Northerners lived and worked, and to the continuous contact they had with people who were their neighbors and their trading partners, sometimes their kinfolk, but always also the avowed enemies of the crown and government. So you'll get a sense here, I hope, that the talk I'm going to be giving you today, is one looks at Scotland from the Northern English borders. So it is a talk about Scots, but it's one that focuses on impressions of the Scots on the part of the English. What I want to do today is to sort of sketch out the effect of the Scots' proximity to Northern England, or particularly their effect on local opinion, largely on the basis of records generated in that region, many of them source materials that have escaped a rigorous analysis. And I'm sorry to put up a slide here with tons of writing on it, but when you're doing legal history, there are technical terms you simply can't avoid. So for those of you who aren't familiar with these terms, I've just popped those up there. So some of these records, as you can see, are the written sources of a royal judicial machinery that operated in the north, just as it did elsewhere in England. Such, for example, are the rolls of the Justices of Assize, who traveled regularly to the northern counties to deliver the shire jails of suspects committed to prison to await trial at what was known as jail delivery. While they suffered the ravages of time and poor storage, collectively, these records constitute valuable sources of information concerning the presence of the king's enemies in the region. Other records were generated in response to the conditions that made the border counties unique. So another kind of source material is of particular relevance here, and that is letters of denization and other documents of their ilk. And I have a copy of one here that I'm going to draw your attention to in just a couple of moments. Among the myriad official records relating to the north, these materials, things like letters of denization, reveal perhaps most forcefully of all the importance of identifying the allegiance of an individual, his or her nationality, if you will, in a period in which there were no nation states, but there were national enemies. The subject of denization in the late medieval period has been examined in the context of the English suppression of alien priories as they were known, during the 100 Years' War, when the crown made a shrewd and profitable use of widespread anti-French sentiment at the expense of continental religious houses, and in studies of the place of foreign-born artisans and merchants in urban societies. The ominous presence of Scottish enemies in the borderlands made the issue of denization, or more accurately, allegiance identification, a matter of immediate concern to the people of that region. Long before letters of denization became the normal means for foreign-born persons to acquire legal status in England, the people of the north, common folk as well as royal officials, had adopted several distinct ways of identifying and controlling Scottish aliens in England. Local men, acting in the capacity of jurors of presentment, trial jurors, always careful to emphasize the alien status of Scottish persons involved in incidents of cross-border crime. And Scots who wished to work and live unmolested in England quickly learned to make themselves known to the royal wardens of the marches and to seek the protection of the English king's peace. By the 15th century, records generated by agents of the English crown argue forcefully for a clear understanding of the importance of national identification in a wartime setting. And I'm going to have a closer look at this letter of denization. It's an interesting little piece of parchment. It's probably the first example, or a very early example, of a form letter, if you will. Note that there are blank spaces in there, and see that this letter was purchased in the name of this fellow, John Mitchelson. Mitchelson was required to come up with 2 guarantors, pledges, if you will, persons of good standing, and they are named in another blank section of this document. The price of this letter is also included in there. And then finally, the last blank space is filled in with the date the letter was issued. So as I say, this is a kind of an early version of a form, a document form. Now, Scots appear frequently in the common law records generated by the work of the Justices of Assize in the northern counties, especially in those relating to the 2 counties that shared border territory, Scotland, Cumberland and Northumberland. From the middle years of the 14th century until well into the 15th, there were persons of Scottish origin at 1 of every 3 sessions of jail delivery convened in Carlisle, and 1 of almost every 2 sessions held in Newcastle. The felonious offences of which they were accused ranged from petty theft to homicide. In the jail delivery records, they're identified by indicting jurors primarily with reference to their allegiance. Thus, in 1431, William Raw, Scottish man, was charged with the theft of goods belonging to an Englishman. He was found guilty and hanged. Richard L. Wood, imprisoned in Carlisle for burglary, was said to be, and I quote, formerly an Englishman, but at the same time in the allegiance of the Scottish king. Still another suspect was named only as Scotsman. The inhabitants of the borders were especially disturbed by the collusion, widespread in the 14th and 15th centuries, between English and Scots in incidents of violence. Cross-border reaving and especially ransom taking occurred on a distressingly frequent basis. Indeed, there thrived a well-established network of small-time hoods along the fords and pathways that linked the 2 kingdoms. Juries of indictment, or presentment as they were known, and trial juries worked tirelessly to charge and punish Englishmen who assisted ransom takers in their midst, because the activities of such offenders further impoverished possessions already rendered meager by wartime conditions. Occasionally, collusion with the Scots threatened the security of the borderlands as a whole, and so assumed very dangerous proportions. This was especially true in moments of heightened tension in the ongoing war between the kingdoms. The arrests of several alleged Scottish spies occurred in the late 13 teens, when the Scots raided as far south as Yorkshire and wrought widespread damage over much of Northumberland, Cumberland, and North Yorkshire. Against the background of terror generated by such raids, a dozen persons were seized on suspicion of being a common spy, or for being a Scottish spy, or in the case of Ismania and Maud Scott, on suspicion of being common spies in England and enemies of the king on behalf of the Scots. A similar, smaller roundup of suspected Scottish sympathizers took place in Newcastle a century later, 1421. Perhaps the reaction to the news of the illness of Henry V in France, more certainly against the background of unstable conditions north of the border following the death of the governor of the Scottish realm, Duke of Albany. From the mid-14th century to the end of the 16th, open war between England and Scotland was periodically suspended by the sealing of truces. These were precious periods of peace, and jurors were always aware of the ease with which they might be broken. Wording of indictments describes some cross-border incidents, tests of determination to apprehend, prison, persons whose unlawful activities constituted breach of the truce. Thus, not only were several men accused of leading the Scottish enemies into England, in order to carry out thefts and kidnappings. Numerous others were also charged with the more nebulous offences of receiving known Scottish thieves, of leading Scottish malefactors into England, then back into Scotland, selling stolen goods to Scottish buyers. Securing the release of Scottish prisoners from English jails was also widely regarded as dangerous because it threatened the security of the truce and rendered unstable the atmosphere in which deliberations between the warring realms might take place. A similar concern with the preservation of a state of temporary peace underlined the otherwise unremarkable arrest of persons robbed Scottish merchants travelling from England. In the spring of 1320, the aftermath of the devastating Scottish raids into Yorkshire, noted a moment ago, just 4 months after the sealing of a truce, William de Wetherell was indicted for stealing oxen and cows from some foreign men, whom the jurors clearly identified as Scots. At the same sessions of jail delivery, several others were also charged with stealing the goods of unknown strangers. While not clearly identified, may well have been Scots, attempting to resume trading links with their Northern English neighbours. A year later, though, tension had subsided, and jurors and justices alike had less pressing reason to be wary of breaking the truce. William Pinder, accused of stealing from a travelling Scot, was released from custody when the Justices of Assize ruled there was no case against him. Toward the end of the 14th and throughout the 15th centuries, the ongoing tensions created by the Anglo-Scottish Wars were reflected in the growing sense of unease, respect of all persons in the Scottish allegiance. While it would be probably misleading to suggest that Englishmen were finding Scots hiding under every bush, the records make it clear that communication between the Scots and the English on an individual basis was ipso facto perceived to be potentially suspicious and possibly felonious. In 1419, the Newcastle man was indicted for communicating with a Scot, divulging the king's counsel to him, and for being a common trader with the Scots, in violation of a recent East March ordinance. Another Northumberland man, William Forster, was formally charged with harbouring a Scot, and was able to avoid trial only because he had the astuteness to point out that his alleged offence did not in fact constitute felony. John Verty, though, was accused of being common receiver and abettor of the king's Scottish enemies. In the late 1430s, it was sufficient merely to be a Scot, be seized and imprisoned on suspicion of felony. The tendency towards judicial construction of the law of felony on the part of Northern jurors was generally met with resistance on the part of the Justices of Assize, and the suspects, whose cases I've just noted, were either acquitted or dismissed outright from court. But the role of indicting jurors in expressing communal sentiment was a very powerful one, and some at least of the indictments laid in the Northern courts, late Middle Ages, may be interpreted as having been tactical, in that they attest a general, widespread disapproval of the ease with which enemy Scots lived, worked, perhaps flourished in their midst. The Scots themselves were not unaware of their precarious place in Northern English society. The local records of royal justice reveal that when confronted with the judicial machinery of the English crown, they too adopted legal tactics appropriate to their needs. Some submitted to trial, trusting that their reputation in the community would ensure their acquittal. Though their numbers are few, it may be suggested that Scots were established members of the community rather than unknown wanderers, might enjoy the benefit of doubt at the trial stage. Thus, John June, a chaplain of Carlisle, was a suspicious enough character to draw the attention of his neighbours in 1356. He was accused of adhering to the king's Scottish enemies, of living in the Scottish allegiance for a long time, and then of returning to England. He was submitted to the rigors of a trial for felony, but ultimately acquitted. On occasion, however, juries dealt especially harshly with persons who attempted to take advantage of wartime conditions by playing both sides of the game. In 1354, Adam the Chapman was indicted one charge of prison breaking and another of kidnapping and holding his master to ransom. He pleaded not guilty and placed himself on the verdict of the country. The jurors informed the justices that in fact Adam was a Scot, born in the land of Scotland, who had accepted the king's peace, sworn allegiance to the English crown, but who had forsworn his oath. The justices accepted the jurors' account and sentenced Adam to be drawn and hanged. Other Scots who attempted to shelter behind opportunistic allegiance were similarly subjected to rigorous treatment by the common law courts. In an atmosphere of profound suspicion directed towards their activities, many Scots deliberately sought to place themselves under the peace of the English king. As early as 1335, commissions issued to the chief royal administrative officials in the north, Wardens of Marches, began to include a clause authorizing them to accept into the king's peace, quote, any Scot who has adhered against us and any who has shown enmity towards us now wishes to come to our peace. By mid-century, the wardens were accepting Scottish oaths of allegiance as a matter of course. Protection of the king's peace differed substantially from that inherent in letters of safe conduct. These were intended only to extend only temporary protection to Scottish travellers through the borderlands. By contrast, the granting of the king's peace was intended to afford aliens the protection of the English crown in perpetuity, on condition that they abide by their oaths of allegiance, and such alien friends enjoyed simple rights at common law. Thus, they could buy, sell, or otherwise convey land, and they had access to English common law courts. For the remainder of the medieval period, in fact, the wardens were kept busy overseeing the swearing of allegiance of numbers of Scots. But in the communities of the northern borderlands, such persons continued to be regarded with suspicion, wartime conditions, seldom tempered tolerance. The crown itself did little to encourage an atmosphere of tolerance, and indeed took advantage of anti-Scottish sentiment when it found it convenient to do so. Thus, in April 1369, King Edward III issued a comprehensive commission to officials in Yorkshire, Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland to make inquisition into the unlawful withholding of revenues pertaining to the royal prerogative, but also, quote, touching all armor, victuals, and other things taken to Scotland or foreign parts, contrary to his prohibition, aliens and strangers not of his fealty dwelling there without his license, and those who receive them. Now, the impetus behind this kind of extensive four-county inquiry is not immediately apparent. Certainly, the king was accustomed to keeping a close eye on financial housekeeping, and his interest in the distant north, as keen as it was in the more proximate south, prompted periodic efforts to reclaim revenues that officials too often subverted to their own uses. The decade of the 1360s, however, was a particularly unstable period in Anglo-Scottish relations, and repeated breaches of the truce by the Scots contributed to a sense of unease in respect of Scottish enemies in the north. The Commission of 1369, then, was perhaps as much an attack on the freedom of enemy aliens to move about within England as it was an expression of conventional concern for the royal purse. In any event, the commissioners carried out their work to great effect. In Cumberland, 4 separate inquests were held in Cumberland, in Carlisle, in April, and the last one in Westmoreland, in the town of Penrith. They revealed a predictable level of corruption on the part of the sheriff and other royal officials in the matter of goods and chattels unlawfully withheld from the crown. More important, these records also show a significant number of Englishmen engaged in illegal activity with the Scots. Thus, a Carlisle jury returned that, quote, Walter Wainman committed felony in both Cumberland and Northumberland, thereafter joined the king's enemies, Scotland. Afterward, he came back to England and resides in Cumberland without license and is received and maintained there by John de Thirlwell and William Dixon. In order to come into England, he sent them 80 beasts worth £10. Several other persons were identified as common carriers, foodstuffs, harness, and war-related material. The intentions of the jurors here were manifest. Englishmen communicated in too open a fashion with the king's enemies, were regarded as of dubious fame, and were profoundly mistrusted by their fellows. Of greater interest to the crown, perhaps, were the 14 so-called aliens of Scottish origin, said to be residing in Cumberland without warrant. Together, their goods and chattels were assessed at over £76. Some constituted a fair haul for the royal coffers, and so rendered the exercise useful. But it did little to address in systematic fashion the Northerners' concerns about the movement of Scots in the border region. In the middle years of the 14th century, the presence of aliens on English soil became a matter of concern to the Commons in Parliament. In 1346, there were calls for the expulsion of alien monks in the kingdom. When the king demurred, Commons responded by asking more vaguely that all aliens belonging to a country at war with the king be arrested and their goods forfeited. Early in 1378, they were mollified when virtually all aliens were ordered expelled from the realm. The 15th century was marked by several outbursts of anti-alienism. And I should make it clear here that I'm very well aware that the term alien is a divisive one, and one that can cause some concern. I'm using the term that's found in the records themselves, in the medieval records themselves. Aliens were simply people who were not of the English regions. So, as I say, the 15th century was marked by several outbursts of anti-alienism. Some were confined to Parliament, but others saw violent attacks on alien communities, especially those of wealthy foreign merchants. Although the Crown enacted legislation aimed directly against aliens only on occasion, there were periods in which high levels of anti-alien sentiment held decisive action. The years 1435 to 1437 were such a period. They led to a heated debate in Parliament in 1439 and to the imposition in 1440 of a national subsidy on all aliens resident in England. The tax, amounting to 1 shilling and 4 pence on every alien householder and 6 pence on non-householders, was renewed in 1442 and 1449, and both extended and made permanent in 1453. Anti-alien sentiment in southern England, and especially in London, is clearly linked to English fortunes in the 100 Years' War of the late medieval period. In northern England, as elsewhere, heightened tension in respect of the Anglo-Scottish War, 1430s and early 1440s, caused nervous Scots to purchase letters patent affirming their loyalty to the English crown, or pardons for their failure in having made manifest that loyalty. In 1437, for example, William Sett paid half a mark, that is 2/3 of a shilling, to have confirmed by the king's letter, his true fealty, which he had obtained from the warden of the East March some 13 years earlier. The legislation of 1439 and 1440 similarly produced a rash of requests for confirmation of English fealty on the part of Scots long resident in the north, and anxious to avoid having to pay the newly imposed tax. Thus, in May 1440, John Killingworth obtained a pardon for having lived in England 58 years without royal license, and permission for him and his son to remain there as Englishmen. The year 1448 saw the renewal of the old alliance between Scotland and France, and a consequent flurry of activity by Scottish residents to secure recognition of their loyalty. The trend continued through the 1450s and 1460s. Attacks by English and Scottish armies into each other's borderlands in the summer and autumn of 1480 similarly drove numerous Scots in England to take steps to reassure the crown of their allegiance. Occasionally, extant records reveal with great clarity the difficulty of living in the environs of the borderline that was itself still ill-defined, and the circumstances in which Scottish aliens might find themselves under suspicion. Thus, in 1431, the chaplain John Earth explained to the Royal Council that although as a child he had been, quote, he had been taken by his mother across the border of Forth into Scotland, as soon as he had his understanding, he came back to England. Then and there, he became the liege man of Henry VI, paying the handsome sum of 10 marks for a formal letter of denization. In 1442, Robert de Linton felt it was wise to inform the crown of the fact that he had been born in Jedburgh, in the March of Scotland, quote, which town at the time of his birth was within the boundaries of England, but afterwards came into the hands of the Scots through a raid and is still occupied by them. He assured the Royal Council of his manifest loyalty and was afforded the protection that he sought. But Linton continued to suffer harassment owing to his alien status, and he was compelled again 20 years later to apply for royal acknowledgement of his allegiance. In periods of particular tension in the north, the necessity to establish denizen status, or at least to secure the protection of the crown, was crucial, because the wide powers granted to the wardens of the marches and other royal officials for the safekeeping of the borderlands were on occasion wielded to the detriment of all Scots found in the region. Despite the sealing of a 10-year truce, 1444, the summer of 1446 witnessed such a dangerous level of cross-border crime in the East March, the warden, Henry Percy, ordered the seizure and imprisonment, quote, of all Scots women found within the boundaries of the said march, together with all of their goods and chattels. Similarly, 1477, Crown appointed a commission to inquire into the report that diverse Scots, women as well as men, wander about various parts of the country, of the county of York, and especially in the West Riding. The commissioners were ordered to arrest and imprison all persons suspected of such being Scottish. These kinds of sweeps were effective in netting troublemakers, but inevitably they also caught law-abiding Scots, the Scottish aliens, and further contributed to the suspicion with which they were regarded locally. Persons hoping to avoid such vexations preempted trouble by seeking certificates, the warden of the march, testing their loyalty. But as I noted just a moment ago, these documents were expensive to procure and undoubtedly afforded only as much protection as the warden himself was able to provide. The alien tax of 1440, although collected in haphazard fashion, was initially assessed with assiduousness that suggested great concern about the movement of foreigners within England. The tax records show that aliens in the 3 northernmost counties of England were almost exclusively Scottish men and women. Most were unskilled laborers, servants, or merely vagabonds, unattached to a specific person or household. The migratory patterns of many of these people made them very visible in small communities of the northern borderlands, and as such, vulnerable to the scrutiny of the local population. Petitions to Parliament on behalf of the Commons of the North, while they usually exaggerate the abandon with which breaches of the truce and letters of safe conduct are said to be effected daily by the Scots, nevertheless indicate that persons in the Scottish allegiance mingled freely with the English were very ubiquitous in the villas and towns of the region. Rivalries among traders, merchants, and craftsmen assumed nationalist overtones in market towns all over England in the 15th century. And there survives substantial evidence to suggest that the larger urban centres of the north targeted the Scots in particular as undesirable business competitors. Several of the guilds associated with the wool trade in Newcastle explicitly barred Scottish-born apprentices. Similarly, the Durham craft ordinances of this period are notable for strong anti-Scottish prejudice that characterized regulations governing apprenticeship. But to a much greater degree than elsewhere in England, businessmen intent on doing harm to their competitors made deliberate use of the proximity of a national enemy. This kind of tension probably explains the troubles experienced by one John Bladesmith, Scotsman who lived in Newcastle. Bladesmith was listed in the Alien Subsidy, compiled in the autumn of 1440, where his name was included among householders in that town. He appeared again in another assessment in March 1444, where his occupation was noted as locksmith. Bladesmith's continued residence in Newcastle was somewhat remarkable, not merely because he was compelled to pay what was becoming an annual tax based on his alien status, but because in 1442 he'd been indicted before the justices of jail delivery and accused of having received in his house in Newcastle in treasonable fashion several of the king's Scottish enemies. He was committed to jail for a year and then released when no further charges were forthcoming against him. The nature of the record here obscures the motives that underlay the accusation made against Bladesmith that resulted in his indictment. But the committal of suspects to prison pending a verdict was a sanction widely employed by later medieval justices for the punishment of persons whose reputation was considered questionable. Bladesmith's year in jail perhaps served as a warning that his neighbours and business rivals in Newcastle regarded his Scottish connections with a great deal of suspicion. The last quarter of the 15th century, although marked by several periods of truce, was nevertheless a period of continual tension in the borderlands. Raids and counter-raids frequently disrupted the Northerners' attempts to resume normal economic activity. But ironically, they also came to provide distressed borderers with a new weapon with which to harass the business and personal rivals. Among the records of the city of York are enrolled certificates of English parentage and English birth, secured by persons accused of being Scottish. The language of these documents makes it clear that such letters were sought as a direct response to accusation or rumor. Thus, John Saunderson of York, Fisher, quote, showed how that he of late, against good and right conscience by the children of wickedness, was wrongfully noted, slandered, and defamed of being a Scottishman and born in Scotland. He appeared before the mayor and aldermen of York in the company of 6 men of good standing from 3 border counties, and again I quote the record, willing to subdue and avoid the said noise and slander, and declare him and prove himself a true Englishman. Thomas Backhouse, John Collin, and several others similarly defamed, noised, slandered as Scots. It all went to considerable expense and trouble to assemble panels of guarantors who would testify to their place of birth in England, the name of their parents and godparents, and any other information that might establish their identities as true Englishmen. It's notable that by the end of the 15th century, true Englishman was one who had been born within England proper. The stabilization of the boundary line in the northeast had rendered rare and largely obscure the kind of dilemma that had troubled claims to English birth of persons like that Robert de Linton, who I talked about just a few moments ago. York letters may not in and of themselves constitute evidence of hatred of Scots, as historian Tony Pollard has claimed. But in the context of the political tensions that characterized Northern society in the late Middle Ages, they are powerful evidence of a profound mistrust of the king's Scottish enemies. Similar echoes of the notoriety traditionally attributed to the Scots are found in the local courts of Durham, where the mere fact of entertaining Scots in her home was regarded as sufficient cause to impose a fine on one unlucky Durham woman. Accusations of being subject in the Scottish allegiance were of no little consequence. In the roundups that were periodically ordered in the borderlands, examples of which I've given you here, Scottish men and women who were unable to find friends and neighbours to vouch for them ran the very real risk of losing their goods and chattels, often permanently. And at no time was the danger of summary confiscation greater than in the last decade of the 15th century. In the year 1490, the English Parliament enacted ominous Statute Against Scotsmen. Preamble to the Act noted repeated breaches by Scotsmen of the truce that had been sealed in 1449, and concluded, for the which it is better to be with them at open war than under feigned peace. The Act compelled all Scots who were not denizens to leave the realm within 40 days on pain of forfeiture and imprisonment. Persons apprehended after that period were to be seized, deported to Scotland. The harshness of the expulsion was mitigated by the Crown's continued practice of selling letters of denization, but it placed a real burden on borderers whose antecedents were suspect. In 1496, for example, Robert Elwald found it expedient to secure a certificate of his English parentage, the Warden of the East March. The urgency of his claim was real and not merely apparent. Robert was descended from a Criminist family whose members hailed from both sides of the Anglo-Scottish borderline. And among his guarantors were men with well-documented and unlawful cross-border connections, such as the Robsons, or, more famously still, the Armstrongs. The national consciousness of Northern English borderers was born amid a long and bitter conflict. It was given expression in myriad ways. The virulent tone of the late medieval chronicles and political songs leaves little doubt that English sentiment in respect for the Scots as a people was characterized overwhelmingly by animosity. In the 14th century, chronicler Peter Langtoft was trenchant in his criticism of the enemy. To the author of the Lanercost Chronicle, whose house experienced at first hand the ravages of enemy raids, Scots were sons of iniquity, cursed children of Belial. In the 15th century, another chronicler warned that the Scots were not to be trusted, for they be ever found full of guile and deceit. The twin themes of Scottish deceit, guile indeed, permeates much of the English historical prose of the later Middle Ages. The vernacular poems, ballads that circulated in the late medieval period also voiced a uniform opinion. Songs that dealt with Anglo-Scottish relations consistently celebrated English victories over the Scots in battle as the triumph of a just people over a menacing, unrelenting, treacherous foe. Now, the place of ballad literature within the cultural milieu of the late medieval North remains a matter of debate amongst scholars. Anthony Goodman argued that the ballads speak to a desire by Northerners to affirm what he termed a common heroic inheritance with the neighboring Scots. He further suggested that the songs encouraged the inhabitants of the Anglo-Scottish frontier to celebrate shared values and, I quote him, as two halves of a powerful and unique society. Another historian of the ballads emphasizes the homogeneity of the early modern borderlands, describing them as a medieval Elizabethan frontier community, and historically, traditionally, almost an independent region. Yet both these scholars also acknowledge that the popular songs idealized an otherwise grim way of life. Beneath the veneer of solidarity and common experience that informed the ballads, there lay the reality of more than 2 centuries, brutal forays and murderous episodes of grieving, kidnapping, ransom taking, only seldom relieved by truce and peace. The records of the royal machinery of English justice, the texts of letters of denization, reveal more accurately than any other source that, for the most part, realities of war rendered friendly cooperation with the Scots, at best tremendously problematic for the inhabitants of the North. Despite close ties with Scottish families who shared their surnames, despite the relative ease with which people in either allegiance traded animals and grainstuffs in the market towns of the borders, the tensions caused by war all too easily and quickly destroyed peaceable intercommunion between these peoples. Well into the Tudor age, an accusation of being a Scot might still send an Englishman scurrying for the protection of a certificate of English birth. Rumors of being too friendly with the Scot might still bring an English northerner before the courts, the royal justices of assize. United in song with their Scottish fellows they may well have been, but in the mundane business of day-to-day living, English borderers of the late medieval period remained acutely conscious of proximity of the national, very dangerous. Thank you. Stop sharing. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia. My goodness, your talk packed a wallop. I'm sure everyone is very taken by your words. We want to open the floor for discussion and for questions. And I'd love to hear from people from the borderlands where your ancestors were from the borders. But I'll just start with one question, Cynthia. You talked a little bit about the indicting of the jurors themselves when they didn't decide in favor of the Crown's viewpoint. And I'm wondering, were all of the jurors who were trying the so-called Scottish criminals, were they all English?
Yes, absolutely. The English common law quite literally stopped at the border. And Scottish common law, based in part on English, but quite unique in its own way, began then at the border. So you would not find a Scottish person sitting on the jury, absolutely not. Nobody in the locality would allow that.
Cynthia, Bruce Allardyce speaking here. Were similar restrictions placed on people who've been born in Flanders, France, Denmark, countries other than Scotland?
There were always restrictions placed on, say, the people that are called aliens in records. Yes, they had very limited circumscribed rights at English common law. But the range and the extent of the restrictions placed on the Scots was considerably heavier than on any other. As I say, in periods during the 100 Years' War, when tensions with France were very high, French monks and French people, the people in the French allegiance would be going after, but not with the consistency and the ferociousness characterized the Crown's relations with Scotsmen and
I guess the other question that struck me is the 20-pound denization fee. That was such an incredible amount for the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was that the same? Was that the same 20 pounds for residents of France, for example? And how many Scots actually could afford 20 pounds?
Right. So no, the 20 pounds was not a standard rate. The wardens at the marches could essentially come up with whatever sum they wanted. And so we were purchasing these letters, you were really at the mercy, as it were, of the authorities. The 20-pound one will have been levied only against somebody who's very well. There's no point in charging 20 pounds for a washerwoman, for example, who lived in Newcastle. If the warden could make some money in selling these things, he would.
So it's sort of like progressive taxation of aliens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Professor, we all are aware of the adage that history is written by the victors. You've presented a very detailed history of the 13th and 14th century, essentially from the English perspective. Is there were the Scots as predatory toward the English as it appears the English were toward the Scots?
The short answer to that would be yes. We do not have anything like these jail delivery records, records of the size. There's nothing like that on the Scottish side of the border. Absolutely nothing. The trial records the region don't begin until the first one is dated 1494. So doing this kind of exercise on the Scottish side cannot be done for the period that I'm covering. But from occasional, but from bits of evidence that do survive, it would appear that yes, the same sort of treatment was being afforded Englishmen in the Scottish borderlands, and particularly the ruthless efficiency with which allegiance might be sold to Englishmen. So I think, as I said, my answer would be yeah, I have every reason to believe that the same thing was happening, but I have not got the kind of record material that I have for England.
Given the rap that the Scots had in the eyes of the English, how did James accomplish his accession to the throne of England?
Wasn't easy. It absolutely was not easy. There was a great deal of opposition in Scotland to the Union. Scots were understandably afraid that they would lose their own legal tradition, that they would lose their language, that they would lose their king. And James was not a frequent visitor to Edinburgh after he moved to London. Charles I, I think, came once. So predictably, the succession was not an easy one. There was as much opposition to James's succession in England as there was in Scotland. So it wasn't an easy matter at all.
I'll never forgive him for what he did to my ancestor.
Well, then, and if you know anything about the border region, you'll know that the wardens of the West March, the wardens of the March area around Cumberland, were almost inevitably Nevilles. So there is some irony in my name being Neville and me being a border historian.
Well, I'm from Galashiels, and I have a great grandfather who was a Robson, who obviously came up over the borders at some time or another. But my family name's Oliver, and we lived in they lived in the middle. And from my knowledge, James I could not get down to England fast enough to get the money, and the borders were just as bad because there was a Mucklemood Meg that served a fork and knife up on an empty plate, which was a sign her guys had to go and bring back cattle from England. And they kept it in the devil's beef tub at Moffat's. So, the Scots weren't much better than the English. In fact, I think the Scots were probably worse.
No, as I said, I have no reason to think Scots were any kinder to the English.
Because, we had a form of justice called Jether Justice. Have you heard of Jether Justice?
No.
Jether is a Scottish name for Jedburgh.
Yep.
And what they figured out, the thing to do was to hang them first and ask them questions later.
Right. No, yeah. That's a local population for you. I assure you that Scots common law did not allow such a thing to happen, but rough justice is rough justice, isn't it?
Professor Neville, what is your contemporary reaction to the frequently loosely applied term someone goes scot-free? Oh,
that's a simple one. It's got nothing to do with being Scottish, absolutely nothing to do with being Scottish. The Scot, S-C-O-T, was a tax imposed on households by the English crown. So if you went scot-free, it means you didn't have to pay the tax on the household. Literally, that's what the word Scot is a kind of tax, got nothing to do with the Scots.
Dr. Julie Potter Dunlop has a question.
Hello, Dr. Neville. Thanks for recognizing me, Jack. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, my camera is on the fritz, and maybe not so sorry. Anywho's, I am a director with the Maine Ulster Scots Project. And my question for Dr. Neville is, was one factor or precursor behind the English crown establishing the Ulster plantation scheme an attempt to remedy, quote, the Scottish problem?
Again, I would suggest yes. The Ulster plantation was part of a plan to civilize, and literally this was the term used by the crown, to civilize the Gaelic population of Scotland. And one way to civilize them was to get rid of them, you could sort of kill two birds with one stone. The Irish, of course, had always been problematic. Sending some Scots over there and granting them lands took care of sort of two problems at once. But it was part of a more general policy. I think historians now see that it's part of a general effort on the part of the English crown to bring Scotland into a closer union with England. And the best way for the crown to do that was to get rid of the problem.
Thank you. I appreciate it. My Dunlops originated in Dunlop Village in Ayrshire, but migrated to the coast of Maine in 1718 out of County Donegal. Thank you.
Right.
Professor Neville, in the Ulster plantations, one figure I encountered was about 60% of the settlers were Scottish, about 40% were English. How did those Scots and English relate to one another in Ulster?
I have to say, I don't really know. It's, I'm going to give you that line that it's sort of not my period. It really isn't my period. I haven't done an awful lot of
This
reading.
would have been the first half of the 1600s.
I just don't know. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
Well, and I've been wondering recently how many of those English were actually Scots recruited to the English military, because they would be counted among the English. And as we all know, that many of the Highlanders were recruited into the military and sent to Ulster too.
Professor, given the common animosity toward the English by the Scots and the Irish, how did the English accomplish maintaining this distance between those two cultures, given that there's so many similarities in terms of their music and in terms of their other aspects of their culture?
I'm not sure what you're asking me. That
So they were obviously divided by religion after the Reformation. And I think that was a major factor splitting the Irish and the Scots. But do you have any thoughts on why they didn't develop a common allegiance toward the English?
I think just the prejudice against the English was so deep and of such long standing that it couldn't easily be done away with. I mean, we're still talking about the division of Ireland, aren't we? We're still regarding as problematic the line that divides the North.
Yeah, but I think it was a religious thing.
It was.
Because it was a religious thing, because most of the Scots were Protestants and the Irish, and particularly in the South, were Catholic. And I think they were sent there because they were better workers than what the Irish were, because Northern Ireland became very, very prosperous under the Scots, whereas the Southern Ireland, which had big estates owned by English people, did not know. The English people did well that lived there, but the Irish people who lived there did not do well.
Well, there was the same sort of prejudice against the Irish in English-held Ireland. Again, a long history of that in the 14th century. The English crown was still barring Irish people from.
Well, I mean, the Irish had a terrible job when they came to the States.
Yes.
I mean, they couldn't. It was very hard for them to find work.
Yes, I know. That's my heritage. My heritage is Irish, and my grandmother tells me stories that would make your toes curl.
Yeah.
Well, I'm half Irish and half Scot, and so I'm constantly at war with myself.
Anyway, I have to leave because I'm preparing dinner for 7 people tonight. So I have to go and look after my getting my dinner organized for tonight. Anyway, it was nice to talk to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Another divide between the settlers in Ulster. The English tended to be Anglican. The Scots tended to be Presbyterian. James I had a dislike of Presbyterians. There was a religious disorder as well there.
You know, I'm probably know just about enough to be dangerous, but I've been reading some books on historiography, which really surround the propaganda developed by historians and the alteration of history in support of one's governmental agenda or national agenda. And, you know, I think this lecture, Cynthia, that you've given today was just full of those kinds of terms, you know, the treacherous foe and Scots are not to be trusted and so on and so on. And I've been, I felt subjected to some texts where Scots were described as barbarians and savages. And I really, I try to be objective when reading, but it does tend to raise my blood pressure a little bit. But I'm trying to come to grips with the fact that distorting history for one's in support of one's agenda or intention seems generally accepted by a number of historians. Do you have any wisdom to share? Because I'm just really touching on this, but it's causing me a lot of angst lately.
I was a little bit surprised to hear that. It's the sort of attitude I would have expected you to find in scholarship from, you know, back in the 50s, 60s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. But in the 21st century, I'm finding it a little bit strange that you're reading about.
They're not all new.
Okay.
These are, you know, 40s, 50s, and 60s, probably, right. Some of the books that I'm being asked to read.
Well, it is part of the winner's story, of course, is to distort or to use history in the winner's service. That's always, it's always been like that. You find the same thing happening all over the world and in all different periods. The English happen to be very, very, very good at it. One reason I can't do a study like this for the Scottish side of the works is that in 1296, Edward I carries all the records of Scotland off with him, takes them back to England and destroys them. So some of them were returned under Charles I. Many of them were lost on that occasion when the ship that was carrying them sank. But Edward I, as far back as 1296, understood that if you steal a people's history, you own them, in a sense. And that's why he took off with these records. I have every expectation that there was a rich body of record material at one point to look at a study of the developing Scots law in the 13th century, but it's gone then.
Yes, there's a book, and the name is escaping me at the moment, by a gentleman named Fisher, and he devoted something like 176 pages to the barbaric, savage Scots, and only 7 pages to the Scottish Enlightenment. And I find this tendency among English authors, English scholars, really. And so thank you for your comment. I've got to come to terms with all of that.
I think you'll get, where you get into this, and the more you start reading Scottish authors, or you'll realize that those kind of attitudes are completely unhelpful.
Thank you.
But they do persist. I mean, I had a fellowship in at the National University of Australia, 2016. I went down there for a few months to take up a fellowship, and it was, people were sort of fascinated that someone could be studying Scottish medieval history in a way, as if there were no laws, as if there were no culture, as if no language. So I was something of a curiosity as a medievalist, as a British medievalist, as a medievalist of Britain, because I was doing particularly Scottish history. So some of that prejudice does still survive.
I'm put in mind as you talk about the victor's effort to stamp out, not only to bring people to their knees, but also to stamp out their culture. I'm put in mind today of reading about the Russians taking Ukrainian artwork and stealing it, taking it back to Mother Russia. It's a phenomenon that just repeats itself.
Yes, I used to have discussions like this one, Connie, with my students, and it was one of the things I tried to get them to understand is that if you steal a people's history, you steal their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much, I'm not sure that that's applicable to Ulster plantation, but it manifestly is applicable to Edward I in the 1290s. He was determined to crush these people as a distinct people. The smartest way to do that is to take their history.
Well, it hasn't worked, and our gathering this morning is evidence of that.
One of the articles I was reading talked about the lasting harm that is done a people when they're defamed unfairly, and that this imagery can often take decades and decades, if not centuries, to be corrected, and that really it's the responsibility of historians to try to correct it in the new, in the new writing. But that Ireland's been very much victimized by this British approach.
It has, yeah. And, I think the problem, as was mentioned earlier, the problem with Ireland too, and with many of the Scots, were based in religion. So the problem with the Irish is they were Catholic. And, even after the English laws changed so that could practice all sorts of religions, that still didn't help cleanse, if you will, the image of the Irish in English eyes. I think it's.
But weren't all of the Scots Irish too until John Knox's time? I mean, Catholic. Weren't all the Scots Catholic too, pretty much?
So were the English. The English were Catholic until 1534.
Yeah, very ironic.
Yeah.
I was surprised when I visited Cape Breton to find that the local populace are Scots, but they're Catholic.
Yeah. I'm not, and you'd have to ask a Canadian historian how that happened. It's not that there aren't any Scottish Catholics, but I'm not sure why. If a lot of these families came over during the time of the clearances, and one of the reasons for the clearances was of course the persistence of Catholicism in the Highlands. So not all Presbyterians were dimly regarded, but Catholics were worse. And many Cape Breton families came over during the clearances to escape the pressure they were under owing to their religion. So that may explain why there are so many Scottish Catholics in Cape Breton. But you'd have to ask the Canadian historian about.
Cynthia, your expertise in the area of law and your focus on legal aspects this morning, I think, was very, very interesting. We have some attorneys on the call. Judy Kerr, I see you. Sandy's probably there. I'm just wondering if any of our legal experts have any comments on Cynthia's talk today.
We go.
Well, I would wonder a bit about the Old Alliance impact and the influence of French law in the development of Scottish law and how that impacted on the tension between Scotland and England.
Scottish common law draws much more heavily on civilian Roman law, civilian law, than English common law does. It's one of the great big distinctions between the two systems is that Scottish common law is very heavily based in the civilian tradition. I don't think that the minutiae, if you will, the way that the Scots conducted trials and whatnot, I don't think that contributed in a meaningful way to anti-Scottish to anti-Scottish sentiment. I'm not sure if I could find a clear link there. It's simply all wrapped up in part of the problem was that Scotland was there. I'm not sure if their legal system was even known very well by most people.
Other discussion? Please feel free to jump in.
This is Bill McLeod. One thing I wanted to mention, the cooperation with the Scots and the Irish against the English. At the castle in Dunvegan on the Skye, there's a trophy there, probably one of the proud trophies that's at the castle. It was given to the MacLeods by the O'Neills, Chief O'Neill, and that was we had sent something like 1,200 mercenaries to Ireland to help fight the English. And I'm not sure the time frame of that. It must have been before the Protestant Revolution, but I think it was quite ancient, and there was a lot of dialogue across Scotland and Ireland, probably a common language, along with the fact that the oceans were the superhighway of the time. They could communicate quite easily by ship. But I'm not sure of the date. It would be kind of interesting to find out. And I'm not sure who this Chief O'Neill is, if that was somebody from Northern Ireland or.
He was from Donegal. I'm going to try to Google real fast, but it was, the flight of the Earls. He and O'Donnell and two others were driven out of Ireland and exile in France, and it was in the 1400s. It may have been during the depredations of Cromwell that they were evicted from their country.
Well, I figured a MacLeod would know. The other thing is, I also know quite a few people in the clan that are Catholic. And I think there was a real confusing there during the Battle of Culloden as to who would support Bonnie Prince Charlie being Catholic.
Yeah. Bill, I'm 2 centuries off. It took place in and not Cromwell. Took place in 1607. O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and Rory O'Donnell, the first Earl of Tyrconnell, left Ulster in Ireland for Europe. They were sent into exile. So it's much later.
Thank you.
You know, I recently discovered that South US was pretty much all Catholic. And I believe, you know, a number of ships sailed during the 1700s from Nova Scotia from there. But I'm trying to remember whether that wasn't MacDonald territory. Was it MacLeod territory? North Uist? They were all Catholics, I think.
Well, we have quite a
I mean,
few,
South US, sorry, forgive me.
we have quite a few MacLeods that are Catholic, and a lot of them did come from Nova Scotia that are here in the United States now.
Yes, I do know that there was an awful lot of movement from particular Cape Breton, to tell you the truth, down to the States.
They have some great fiddlers up there.
Yeah, very good.
I'm Bruce Ogilvie, and I don't know if you can hear me or not, but the most important part of this discussion about religion really should take up another whole subject of an interview with somebody who is an expert on the religious background and history that took place in Scotland, starting in the 14th century and moving through the 18th century. The effect was that the Roman Catholics who remained often were martyred. My own predecessor, St. John Ogilvie, as a Roman Catholic saint, he was martyred in 1615 in Glasgow. And he is descended from the same family that is currently the Earls of Airlie. And we have always celebrated the fact that he stood strongly against the Protestant Revolution as it took place in Scotland. So if you ever want to discuss that in greater detail, that's a very important subject.
Part of the
Thank you.
the problem, if you want to call it that, in the Ulster plantation period was the persistence of Catholicism in particularly the Highlands. Problem, of course, was that the Presbyterian Church could never afford, and could understand why, it could never afford to send permanent missions, if you will, to all the hundreds of thousands, well, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but to the hundreds of small communities in the Highlands. So it's in many cases, the Scots, the Catholics who were in the Highlands, Catholics by conviction, that they've been raised Catholics, we're doing it necessarily to oppose Protestantism. We just were never exposed to Protestantism. The Scottish Church took 2 or 3 generations, understandably, for the Scottish Church to create a priesthood, a ministry, if you will, to get out and preach. And as ever, the Highlands were a difficult place to preach, especially if you didn't sail. I mean, if you were not into sailing, a difficult place to reach. So Catholicism remained there for a very, very long time. So if you find hatred of Catholics, Protestant hatred of Catholics, the frustration of the early Presbyterian Church in reaching these people, that I think helps to explain why so much of the Highlands remained Catholic. There's systemic, if you will, problems with the Protestant Church.
That would be a fascinating subject. I agree with you, Bruce. Just as long as it doesn't produce sectarian strife among the participants.
Well, I tell you what, I'm a Catholic and I felt very welcome.
Well, I think that possibility always exists, of course. The real problem has been in the United States is that we have quelled a lot of those discussions on the basis that it's not relevant to our current lifestyle. The truth is that we are all descended from various Scottish and English and Irish and Welsh and Norwegian backgrounds. And the most important part of that process is that we have quelled all the animosities which we had from generations ago. I have studied it fairly thoroughly, and it does tell me that the most important single thing is understanding and making sure that we clearly understand that those are things that took place in the past and that today we have a very different viewpoint.
Well, it's taken a long time. My sister married an Orangeman, and his parents were really not happy with that union for a period of time, and that's not so long ago. But finally the Bells and the Rainies made peace with the Armstrongs and the Colemans, but it took quite some time.
Bruce, you don't happen to have a recommendation for a speaker that I could reach out to on that subject, do you, or anyone?
I think you'd have to find a church historian who really is not biased in any direction. The most important group of people at University of Chicago Theology School might be a good source to start with anyway.
So there's Colin MacLeod at St. Giles Cathedral.
Let's start at the top, Bill. Okay, I'm not afraid to approach him. No, actually, I just served on a committee that he headed up. So yeah, we could. Great idea, Bill.
And I had recommended, sorry, Dr. William Rolston out of the Ulster Scots Agency.
Yep.
Okay, very good. I think Jack's trying to get our attention to tell us we're almost out of time. Jack, am I reading your mind?
No, I was just going to Julie Potter Dunlop already gave her suggestion.
Oh, good.
Also,
Yeah, I don't have my chat up, but would you mind getting that down for me?
Sure.
Okay, I'm having trouble today with manipulating. Okay, so Jack isn't shutting us down. What other discussion? This is very interesting.
I'd like to point out that the animosity still hasn't gone away, because in Glasgow they still have the Orange Marches.
Yes, they have them all over Canada. They're all over the place in Canada, in Ontario in particular. There are still marches.
And they make a point of the Billy Boys going marching through the Catholic neighborhoods, and then the Catholics throw bottles and stuff at them as they're marching through, you know. And by the way, if you see my picture, I can't get my camera stuff to work right. And the picture up there makes me look like a Billy Boy, and that's not really the reason I'm wearing orange is because that's from the University of Illinois, not because I'm a Billy Boy.
We want to see your real face one of these days, George.
Connie.
Yes, Bonnie, please.
This is Bonnie Reese. Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot about this meeting and I joined it late. I do have a high interest in the religious part of this because my family in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, it turns out, they were very strongly Catholic. I have 21 priests from that area and one Mother Superior. And I probably could check on them. I have no animosity towards Presbyterians or so I'm at peace with everybody. But yeah, if you want any research or anything, I'd gladly contact my family in Nova Scotia.
Well, and I have to, and I'll say yes to that invitation, Bonnie. So I'll follow up with you. I just have to point out what I'm trying to do. I landed an 8-week teaching post in conjunction with Moraine Valley College, and I've put a class together which I've invented, and it's called Ireland and Scotland: History and Culture. And my whole intention is to show just how parallel and how similar our two cultures have been and how much we have in common, including our enemies, and ultimately that we're really first cousins. We started from the same Celtic roots, and that we're more similar than virtually anyone else I've run across. And so I'm hoping to build some new bridges of understanding here in Chicago, where there's still a little bit of animosity that people like Bill McLeod and I have confronted from time to time at the St. Patrick's Day Parade when we're marching and accosted as Scots. But we all need to work towards that goal. We should all love one another, and there's so much commonality there.
You know, especially when we won the most colorful unit in the parade, the St. Patrick's Day Parade. We weren't green. I guess that was the whole.
Yeah.
Bill McLeod, I think you donate to the Dunvegan Foundation.
No, that's another McLeod.
Got another William McLeod.
Yeah.
Apropos of nothing, I recommend after this discussion that you check out a great song by Silly Wizard called "The Parish of Dunkeld." You'll love it. They know how to celebrate. They know how to praise the Lord in a classic Scottish way. Parish of Dunkeld.
We'll all do that, John. You know, the Irish have actually done okay for themselves, and I'm being very opinionated here. But when I was going through and looking at the withdrawals of the British Empire from conquered countries, Ireland was one of the first to gain their independence, which was in 1922. So Ireland gained their independence from the British Empire before India or Middle Eastern countries or other countries. So they really pioneered the way there. So
yeah. Watch the film Michael Collins.
Okay.
Find out how.
The English did crush their culture, though, in that they have not been able to reestablish Irish as their language. There are very few people. Well, I guess it's probably a lot more can speak Irish than can speak Scottish Gaelic, but it's what? It's the opposite.
I think it's the opposite. There are a fair number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland now. Fewer Gaelic speakers in Ireland.
Yeah, like I had read somewhere that the languages in Ireland with the most speakers, first it's English, second was Polish, and the third was Mandarin Chinese, and then fourth was Gaelic.
Right.
Well, and Scotland has 4 approved national languages, and one of them is sign language for the deaf. I read on the internet. So very progressive, and I was so proud of that.
And their sign language is probably very different from American Sign Language too.
Well, do we have any other pressing comments or questions for Cynthia today? Or all of us?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We are over time. Cynthia, it's just been very value added having you today. I just can't thank you enough. You've given us a lot of food for thought to take with us. And so anyone who would like Cynthia's email address, please reach out and we'll be happy to provide that if you have additional questions for her. And I just want to thank all of you for being with us today and for supporting this important historic enterprise that we have going. Jack, I want to thank you for all you do. Couldn't do it without you. And welcome back from Japan. And Gus, if you're still on, thanks for your leadership and support on all of this. Don't forget, February 11, 10 o'clock a.m. Central Time, Bruce Allardyce, Dr. Allardyce will be speaking next month to us on Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. And so that should be very heartening and stimulating. So on that happy note, I will wish you all safe travels, safe time, and thank you.
Thanks, Connie. This was absolutely outstanding. Outstanding.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to get in touch with you, Dr. Julie, so I will do that.
I look forward.
Connie, I want to sign up for your class.
Hey, please, please.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.